Okay, so we're recording. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our final series in our AOS Student Affairs Committee monthly series for the summer, which has been all about preparing for conferences. And our final webinar today is on interacting with your invisible audience, which has become something that is all too familiar for many of us. But we're all here to hopefully learn about some tips and tricks for making that process easier. So my name is Jenny, and I'm one of the organizers of this event. The other organizers are Mayna, Teresa, and Jen, who are all here. So thanks to them for all of their help in getting this event together. We'll now take a minute to introduce our panelists. So panelists, I will call on you as I see you on the screen. And if you could just say your name, your institution, your career stage, and then one piece of advice that you have about giving an effective virtual presentation. Glaucia, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Glaucia Del Rio. I am a PhD student at Louisiana State University, and I'm hoping to finish my PhD in the next semester. And if I would give a tip on giving a talk or presentation, it would be to start with a hook. Start with an anecdote or a personal story, or even a joke if you're comfortable with. I know usually we are tempted to start with like a textbook introduction, but I feel like if we have a hook, something that we will answer in the end of the talk, people tend to pay more attention to the entire talk. That's it.
Thanks. Scott, can you go next?
Yeah, happy to. My name's Scott Yanko. I'm a postdoc at the Max Planck Yale Center for Biodiversity Movement and Global Change. It's kind of a mouthful. And yeah, so if I had to give one tip, I was thinking a lot about sort of managing your audience's cognitive load, like how much information you're giving them at any one time, and thinking about how you design your slides and what you're saying. And that's, I think, good advice in person or virtual to sort of reduce the amount of text and how much that you're sort of throwing at your audience at any one time. But my tip was actually one of the things that I used recently in thinking about these digital talks was actually to go and look at things like the news or John Oliver or old Colbert Report shows, because I realized that what they were doing is actually giving the same format of a digital talk, and thinking about the way that they use multimedia, pictures, videos, clips, and text to enhance what the message that they're delivering is just directly analogous to our scientific talks. That's maybe we have stuff that's a little more complex. And so it sounds a little bit hokey, but you can look to resources like that and think about how they're designing the visuals that go along with the talk and how they're sort of pacing the structure of information. So find shows that you find effective at communicating complicated topics and sort of model your strategy around that.
Great, thank you. That sounds like a really fun way to do research. Allison, can you go next?
Absolutely. Hello, I am Allison. I am assistant curator of ornithology at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, so kind of equivalent in career stage as an assistant professor. And let's see, I also to note is I run the event pilot platform of the meeting. So if you have any platform specific questions, I can answer them for you. My tip, which is also pretty similar to what's also been said, is to really think about the story you want to tell with your research and try not to cram too much in. You know, we've all done, if you're like me, you've done a million analyses and you want to get all those analyses in because they're all so exciting, but you know, you really want to pick and choose and not overwhelm your audience. And that also goes for like text on slides and things like that. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Natalia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia García. I'm a researcher working at the Argentinian Museum of Natural Sciences. So I'm here in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And so I was going to say something really similar to what Allison said. So I'm going to go to a bit of a more maybe technological tip, and it's like I would recommend that not only check that your Wi-Fi connection and lighting and everything is working on, but I think it's always a good idea to maybe have a practice call with a friend or someone who can make sure that, you know, the audio is appropriate. Like maybe you think you sound perfect, but someone on the other side of the line will say like, actually, I don't hear you that well. Maybe you wanted to use a microphone. Maybe you want to use headphones that I usually don't use, but, you know, depending on your setting, it might be a good idea to do that.
Great, thank you. Felicity?
Hi, and really thanks for the invitation to participate. I'm Felicity Arengo. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And I've been a professional for about 25 years, so I guess I'm at a senior level in my career. And one of the things I do at the museum is organize the Student Conference for Conservation Science. And if you're not familiar with that, you can go check that out on our website. But it's it's an annual conference that we organize for 3 days. So we have a lot of experience in that. I guess the risk of going last is that everyone stole your good ideas, because everything that everyone said are ones that I had. But, you know, I would go with the rudimentary, the basic of practice, practice, practice. You have to be so comfortable with giving that talk that, you know, you could do it in your sleep, and you can reduce the risk of freezing and forgetting something just because you know exactly how to do it. And again, yeah, also practice with friends who are, you know, here I have a virtual audience, so make sure that they're virtual and have the same exact setup you're going to be using. Just to go a little bit further, if you can have 2 monitors, it helps to have more real estate that you can work with, so you can show your presentation. And there's a function on Zoom that allows you to pick a section of the screen that you want to share in the advanced settings and have that block your presentation, so you know that's what everyone's seeing. And then you have all this other space. You have still some space on a monitor where you can put your presentation notes or a Word doc or however it is that you're looking at your presentation. And you could also put the people's faces, you know, make sure that you're at least looking at some faces and not staring into a black box. So you could read your audience a little bit, but that's, you know, that's where I would start, is just practice and have your setup that you're going to be using, and don't try to innovate on the fly the day of your presentation.
Great, thank you. And finally, we have Chris.
Hey everyone, my name is Chris Sayers. I work as a tropical bird specialist at the Biodiversity Research Institute in Portland, Maine. And I started that job after finishing my undergrad at Cornell in December. And then I will be transitioning into a PhD program, hopefully in the next 1 or 2 years. And then my piece of advice is that the speaker should be the most excited person about the subject matter on the Zoom chat. So really be sure when you're getting in the zone to make your presentation that you're letting your passion show through to the audience, and that helps to draw their attention and bring them in closer.
Wonderful, thank you everybody. So we're going to transition now into answering some of the pre-submitted questions that we got from folks who registered for the event. And I just wanted to say to our panelists that if you have thoughts on any of these questions, please feel free to jump in, but don't feel like you have to answer every single question. So the first question that we have is there a good way to start a talk to attract the attention of the audience in virtual seminars? And some folks touched on this in their answer or in their introduction, but any other thoughts from the group?
I'll jump in if I can. Glaucia said to use a hook, I believe, and I think that's great advice. Sometimes you could also start with something interactive, like let's say I'm gonna give a talk on, you know, flamingos in South America. I start off saying, so, you know, how many flamingo species are there? And get the people excited about thinking about how many there are, and then just, you know, you can transition to the talk. It's kind of a rhetorical question. You are going to answer it, but you know, it's just a little way to have something interactive as you start. And you could then do that maybe if, you know, if it's a 10-15 minute presentation, you could do another moment of interactivity in the middle of the talk.
I would just like to add that as a backup to either the idea of Glaucia or Felicity of like starting with a hook or like a question or something interactive. When I was younger, I used to be like way more structured, and my first slide would always be like, you know, like the talk name, like the title of the talk and the names of the people and start. And I think you can be a little bit more flexible. And if you're going to start with a joke or a question, you can easily back that up, since now visuals are going to be like visuals on the slides instead of you maybe interacting with the people. You can definitely back up that with a GIF, like a animated video, like animated image or anything that can make it from the beginning to make you focus on that. And then maybe you can go on to the more formal, you know, slide of introducing your talk.
I think too, somebody mentioned earlier, starting with a joke if you can. I think that's, if you can do it, great advice. It also just sort of, for me anyhow, it relaxes me. Like if you get nerves, it can be really helpful. But I think too, to also highlight, you know, the idea that your talk isn't your whole paper, and it's okay to like shed away those details and cut to the chase. And so if that's what you're doing, and I apologize, I can't remember. I know somebody suggested that earlier to really hone in on the focus parts, but it's okay to sort of start that with like, I want to tell you a story about X, right? Make it really clear up front what you're emphasizing. And I think it's even okay to use that language of story, but something that sort of can work as that hook and keeps it really simple is what to focus on, at least in my opinion.
Now, my addition to this is very AOS specific for this particular conference, but I'll just remind everyone, if you haven't looked, for one other tip is to look at all the instructions for speakers that we give you, because we put all sorts of useful information there. And for AOS, since it's pre-recorded, we also ask that you left the first 15 seconds of your talk empty, just the slide, so that there's time for people's screens to buffer, basically. So, you know, these are some of the other things to take into account when you're planning your talk too.
One thing then, if the talks are pre-recorded, and I don't know if this is required, but if you're providing, I would suggest if it's not required that you provide captioning for your talk. Is it required? I'm not sure.
It's very highly suggested. We can't require it, but basically,
okay. Yeah. So if you're going to provide the captions, remember to leave room at the bottom of your PowerPoints so that the captions don't overlay like your graph labels or anything. You know, you have to leave a few inches, and maybe that's in the technical guidelines. I apologize, I didn't look at them because since I didn't register for a talk, I don't think I have access to them, but make sure you leave that space at the bottom so the captions aren't overlaying anything that's important to see on the slides.
Great, thank you, everybody. I think we'll move on to our next question. So do you have any tips to overcome mental freezes during presentations?
I think it's what Dr. Arengo mentioned before. Practice. I don't know, until it's really annoying and boring to do it. I did do it like tens of times with people watching you, without people watching you. That's what helps me, because yeah, if I just improvise or if I practice a couple times, I will have mental freezes, especially because it's my second language. So it's not as natural as it would be my first language. So practice, I think, it's really, really important.
I would also recommend that people make sure their talk is shorter than the allotted time. by maybe a minute or two if you can afford it. And then you can transition to the Q&A. But there's nothing more disconcerting than when you get the warning that you only have a minute left. So when you get that warning, you want to be like done. You want to be already in your conclusions or about to finish, so that you know see a minute and you get tripped up. Also be aware of when the warnings are coming. I don't know if you're doing 5-minute warnings or if you're doing 1-minute warnings, but it's good to know also what is it that you're going to see. When you're doing your practice session with your friends, maybe they can do that warning for you also, so that you're recreating the situation that you're going to be in.
A more technical tip that I like to use is, if you're someone that relies on notes while presenting, I sometimes bold or highlight certain problem phrases or words that, if I notice while practicing, I kept getting tripped up on. It kind of triggers that that mental pathway. And so I guess to take a step back, for this conference, since it's going to be recorded, the mental freeze might not be so much of a problem, because you can just go in and edit out those problem situations. So good luck, everyone.
Yeah, in cases where it is live too, it's okay to take a second and like have, a few seconds of silence, take a drink of water, refresh where you are. That's absolutely okay. So don't be afraid to do that too.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to that. It always feels worse as the speaker when you freeze than it does for the audience. And the surest way to make it more noticeable to your audience is to apologize and appear flustered. I think, yeah, it's okay to just relax, and we all have those moments, and your audience probably doesn't notice that you're frozen if it's just a couple of seconds.
I just wanted to add, following a little bit what Glaucia was saying. English is obviously not my first language either. So I did find that I do need more practice and more sticking to a sort of script when I'm trying to give a practice in English. But actually, when I do give talks in Spanish, I feel much more comfortable not having a something strict scripted to follow, just more improvising. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, try to know yourself a little better. I find it, at least when I'm giving a talk in Spanish, much more comfortable just knowing the story I want to tell, like following what Scott and Allison were telling. Like, if I have a general idea of the main ideas that I want to talk about and in which order, for me at least, it's much easier to just improvise and not trying to stick to like really yeah, I don't know, like structure script, because that actually makes me more prone to freezing. So but it's funny that it's different if it's in Spanish or in English. So I think it's important that you know how you better function to prepare for these cases. And also following a little bit what Chris was saying, I think the virtual setting has the advantage that you may have some notes out of the screen, like people cannot see, that you may have some tools that you don't have in a living presentation, like when you're given a actual talk in a conference. So it's not a terrible idea to have like maybe a notes that people cannot see in your desk while you're talking to.
Yeah, I also feel like, as Chris was saying, it's really important that like you sound passionate about what you are talking about, like, and the most interested person. And that could be more difficult in a pre-recorded talk. If mental freeze is not a problem, I think we still need to pay attention to that if we are actually conveying our passion and interest in the subject that we are talking about, even in a pre-recorded talk. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I think that's a good transition to our next question. So we already talked a bit about kind of hooks and grabbing the attention of the audience in virtual seminars. But someone asked if you have any specific strategies that you use to keep your audience engaged throughout a seminar. especially in a virtual format.
I don't know if this is a specific tip, but thinking of what Glaucia was saying, I noticed that people, when they have the chance to pre-record talks, they go into a very monotone way of speaking because they're more worried about like saying everything perfect and not having this blanks and not tripping over words. And that for me is actually distracting and making it a kind of more boring. I actually feel it's much more natural hearing someone having, you know, different voice tones variation and maybe tripping in a word and saying, no, sorry, I mean, and that keeps it more natural, even if it's pre-recorded. So I don't know if it's a tip, but I would say, like, I would rather you don't over record the same talk like 20 times until it's perfect, if that makes it like very, you know, same tone, same boring, similar way of speaking, very slow. But that's more of a personal preference than a tip. I don't know what other people think about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think this is actually a situation where a mental freeze could actually help you. So I learned that if you take, you know, a couple seconds between major points, it helps to like bring the audience closer to you because they're like, oh, what are you going to say next? So yeah, taking many pauses, speaking slowly is a way that I try to engage my audience further, keep them interested.
I find it helps also as you're telling your story to put some personal anecdotes about your field work. You know, if you're talking about the data, say, you know, these data, I collected them like this, and you know, it started raining and I had to run out and get shelter, or, you know, it's just something very brief story about, you know, what happened while you were doing your work, or you saw something interesting, and, you know, just put in something that shows that you're, you know, you're in the field and you're doing the work just like, you know, other people in the audience are, and you can share something interesting that you know, some people would be super interested in hearing about your work. That's just, you know, your personal experience with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is also where having interesting visuals is especially important for these virtual talks, and lots of pictures and not a lot of text. That's generally a good theme. And also, you know, one thing to think about, if that might help you in terms of, you know, how you're speaking, or even like maintaining eye contact, which I know is a later question, but sorry, I'm going to answer that a little bit early, but if you can have a friend that you're recording with, and have take turns basically standing behind the computer. So when you're giving your talk, you're not giving it to just the computer, but you're giving it to your friend. And if they put their face like right above the camera area, like the little camera, that's where you want to be looking. And so that's going to help you both maintain eye contact with your audience, but also have like a friend that you're basically giving this talk to. And that might help to be more empathetic, and with some of the other tips that, excellent tips that the other panelists have given.
Yeah, it also might help to have an actual virtual audience, aside from a live audience, to keep you dynamic and interesting. It helps to know where the audience is going to be on your screen the day that you give. Oh, well, you're pre-recording, so I guess that doesn't really matter. But for the Q&A, that's going to, you know, you want to know how to, you know, how to pin the people who are talking, or put the person who's answering the question on your screen. Is it going to be a Zoom meeting or a Zoom webinar?
Zoom meeting.
Okay, so you will see the audience, and you know, it's good to see when you're in the Q&A where those people are going to be on your screen.
Yeah, so I think that's a good transition to our next question, which is specifically about actually directly interacting with your audience. So how should we use the chat box during a scientific talk? And are interactions to the chat box appropriate? You know, and then I think to kind of build off of that, how should we be thinking about like the question and answer session after after the end of the pre-recorded talks, and what are some strategies that we can use to effectively use that time?
I'm going to jump in with this because there's a few specific things for the AOS meeting. But so the way the talks are going to be presented, we're using what's called simulive, which means that the talk will play at the recorded time, at the time that's set, and it won't be available before then. And so we are asking speakers to be available to answer by text questions that come in during the talk. So you'll be able to actually see comments or questions during your talk, while it's happening, and you can answer those live. One advantage is you can answer them while you're talking because you've already recorded the talking part. But I absolutely, yes, you should use these kind of chat text. Zoom chat, of course, won't be a thing except for during the Q&A that's live, but use the comment section to interact with other presenters and to answer questions from people. Also Slack. We recommend that you'll join our Slack and don't hesitate to strike up conversations with interesting talks that you see, or to talk about your talk with people that you want feedback from.
Good.
No, I was just going to say that it's really good for us students to have that opportunity, because usually like in conferences, like that what we are in person, it's like, I don't know, I feel embarrassed and shy to ask questions in talks because I'm a student and I prefer to let that for the senior professors. But with these, I feel that we are much more comfortable to ask questions. So I think it's encouraging, especially because we can do it along the talk and not only in the end. So it's nice.
Yeah, and actually kind of building on that, really the best part of conferences is missing in a visual format, right? Which is all the interactions that happen between the talks and at dinner and mingling at poster sessions. And so I think it's really important to make sure that your audience has other ways to follow up with you. I know that I have the experience a lot of having a question for a speaker that's maybe not quite ready in the allotted time. Like I know I have a question, but I haven't put it all the way together, and making it easy for that person to follow up with you so that you can get something close to that follow-up interaction. So email, if there's it sounds like there's a Slack for the conference, so how they can find you there, if you use Twitter, whatever it is. And if it's not a webinar and it's a Zoom meeting, you could even drop your contact info that you want people to use in the chat when your talk starts playing, but don't make it hard for your audience to follow up, because that's the best stuff.
Yeah, I think it's especially advantageous to have that Q&A interaction to extend the time that would normally be allotted for questions, because usually it's only 60 seconds, which is really only enough time to answer maybe one or two. But I've seen Q&A sessions go well into the next talk. Maybe you can move it into more of that private exchange on Slack or something. But yeah, it helps to keep that conversation alive. I also think it's a really cool tool to share links to papers or other important links of articles and sharing of information, like Scott was saying, with contact information, but also scientific resources as well. So yeah, use it to your advantage for sure.
And I'll just add that you could also set up your own times to have your own like Q&A sessions too. So, you can put your contact info as a comment on your talk in Event Pilot. And you could also say, hey, from 2 to 2:30 on this day, I'll have this Zoom link. And then you can put the Zoom link right there, and then anybody can stop in and chat with you during that time. So there are many different options for kind of engaging with others.
Great. So let's move on to our next question. I think I'm going to actually combine the next two questions we have. So these questions are about actually engaging with the audience with your hands and with your eyes, like hand gestures and eye contact. So one person specifically asked, how should we use hand gestures versus pointing with the mouse? is using hand gestures effective? And then someone else asked if you had any tips for maintaining eye contact during a virtual presentation.
I think that one of the things that's a little bit better than pointing, I mean, there are tools in Zoom that are even better than the cursor, like there's little highlight things, but oftentimes they're not tricky to use, but they're a little clumsy. And there's a lot of setup time. One of the things that I really appreciate is just build your slides slowly. So use the animations if you're comfortable with that, although make sure you're comfortable with it because you can mess things up easily. But you can also just make the full version of your slide and then make a bunch of copies and delete back so that as you click through, it slowly builds. It's sort of along the lines of what I was saying at the very beginning about managing the cognitive load for your audience, right? It's all about like how much information are you asking them to hold kind of in RAM at any moment. And so in a live talk, you can go up and point to the axes of your graph and say, this is what's on the X, this is what's on the Y. Even that is trickier. And I think I'm probably not alone among scientists. Like if you put a graph on a screen, I'm going to try to figure out what it says. And if it's at all tricky, my brain is going to stop hearing you while I try to read your axis labels and figure out the message of the graph. Like I can't help it. And so one way you can fix that is like build your graphs up, right? Show the axes and tell people what you're going to show them, then put your data points on, then put, a regression line on, or, it's just an example, but, really control what your audience is able to see as you go through your talk.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I found out the hard way that what I thought my cursor was doing was not what people were seeing. So walking people through the graph and describing, my x-axis is this, the red bar is describing this, the green bar describes this, and just walk people, point them to the parts of the graph you're talking about and walk them through the graph. It's also for a question of accessibility. It's just, the more information you give people, the better.
Yeah, just a small point. So I was definitely a big advocate for the laser pointer prior to Zoom conferences. Obviously, you have to control for handshake and things like that, so you got to be careful. But a good tool that's kind of analogous to that for a virtual talk is to use the shape function. I use it Google Slides, and I usually pick like a red color to draw the eyes of my audience to a certain part of the screen. And I think that's really helpful, like Scott was saying, to break it down and to explain different parts of the graph at different time steps. And in terms of the eye contact point, I honestly think it's less important to maintain eye contact, especially with the camera, because the speaker themselves is so small, and usually I'm not even looking at the speaker while I'm looking at the slides. But yeah, I mean, I think it's perfectly fine to gaze just off center of the camera, say your notes or something, and still be considered to be engaged, an engaging speaker.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that people are not usually looking at us. So it's more important that we have like these differences in tone along our talks, and that we really synchronize what we are saying with the things that are showing up in the slide. Like Scott said, like add each axis of the graph at a time. You don't need to do fancy animations to do that. You can just like separate in different slides, and then one slide will come with the y-axis, the other slide will come with the x-axis, the other slide will come with the points. Or if it's a map and you have like different populations to show in a map, you can add the points in the map in different slides too. And if you synchronize with what you are talking, it becomes really clear the message that you are trying to convey. So I think that's the most important part. We need to make the audience leave the talk feeling smart, feeling that they actually follow what you were saying and not just overwhelm people with information. So
I just wanted to say that I agree with everything that the other panelists were saying, especially what the topic that Scott brought first of the slide doesn't need to be in its final form the first time it appears. So if it's gonna end up having like, you know, several bullet points, you can make them appear in order. I find that much easier to focus than having all of them from the beginning and then the speaker pointing at them with a either the mouse cursor or the laser pointer or whatever. So yeah, and then I'm not, yeah, I don't know that much about like eye contact, because as I think Chris was saying, maybe you're in a small portion of the screen, but there might be the chance that you are talking and I do pay attention to like authors doing things with their hands, but again, this might be a bias of my cultural heritage, and we do use a lot of hand moving when we're speaking, and it does if it's like what a situation like what Glaucia was saying, that she was like talking about populations or things. I do find that engaging. I do like people just using their hands and not being like just straight like this as if they were taking a mug shot or something like that.
Great, thank you, everybody. So we have 2 more questions that are pretty specific. The first question is, should we use virtual backgrounds or not?
I especially like them when you're using them to your advantage and kind of setting the stage for your talk. So one of the things I really like to see is if you're doing field work and in a really cool place, show a picture of your field work behind you or your field environment behind you. I think it can be slightly distracting if you choose kind of a funny picture, say like a toucan opening its mouth, kind of trying to eat you. But yeah, I think it totally helps to set the stage for your talk and kind of immerse people.
I'd have to say that I'm not a fan of the virtual backgrounds. I find them distracting, and the way that when you move, that you kind of have this halo, and I personally, and maybe it's a generational thing, I'm not a fan of the background. I'd much rather see, and I know that some people, if you have roommates or depending on where you're filming and broadcasting from, it might not be that great, the kind of background, but there are tricks that you can do to set your background so that it isn't distracting. And in fact, I have a document, some resources I can share about how to set up your space for recording. So that, yeah, that my preference is, to see where someone is sitting in their room or in their office or outside. You could do it at the talk outside, but yeah, personally, I'm not into the virtual backgrounds myself. I find them distracting.
I think there's a way too, you can just blur your background. So if you are in a setting where you don't want to share your background, but you want to manage distractions, I think there's a way to like make it kind of hazy behind you. But the point too, that I think the other panelists have really highlighted too, is that your background is a choice and is communicating something to your audience, kind of whether you want it to or not. So it's at least worth thinking about what you want to communicate with that. It's good advice when you're teaching too.
Just related to this is you should pay attention to your lighting. It's better if you have your face nicely lit up versus if you're in a really dark place or you're backlit or something like that. Just be cognizant of these things.
Yeah, and that's a document I can share that the director of the public programs at the museum gave us for when we're preparing talks. So I'd be happy to share that PDF with everyone.
Allison, can I just chime in to ask where we can download the conference background that's up for use? Because I saw that mentioned in the guidance document, but wasn't actually able to find where to download it on the website.
Ooh, that's a good question. That may be something that has not yet been created and slipped through the cracks. So let me get back to you on that. I'm sure we'll be sending out an email with that information soon.
Well, we can also send it as follow-up to the participants of this event. So if you want to send that to us
Okay.
after, we can include that.
Yes, so we will have a conference background theoretically as well.
Great. So we have one more question that I think is partially covered in the guidelines document that was posted, but someone wanted to know if there will be translation support to other languages such as Spanish. So maybe Allison, this is something that you in particular can speak on for the group.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the resources to like have people translate your talks and things like that. We tried it last year and it just didn't work. And so we are recommending that you use a program like DeepL to translate your talk, and or if you know people or you have money to pay for that, I mean, who knows? So what we're recommending is to have either 2 languages on your slides. Yeah, there's also the PowerPoint can do caption translations. The question is if they're good enough or not. In many cases, we think that having English captions might be more helpful than having Spanish poorly translated things. But again, that's kind of up to you. But what you can do is actually either have translations of all your text on your slide in 2 languages, and or you can actually upload different versions of your PowerPoint slides as PDFs, which is what we're recommending, in different languages. And you could even, if you have a script that you read, you can have your whole script in the different languages too. So you have the option of uploading PDF documents along with your recording. That way somebody could open, the translated version of your slides and have that open alongside your talk when they're watching it. So that's kind of what we've come up with.
Great, thank you. So at this point, we're going to open it up for everyone, all attendees, to ask questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please drop your question in the chat and I can read it out. Or alternatively, if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question out loud, you're also welcome to do that. And we don't have any questions yet. So, oh, we do have one. Oh, another Jenny. Jenny, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Just some low-hanging fruit as a question. What is one thing that y'all cannot stand to see in a presentation?
Lots of tiny text filling slides.
Yeah, definitely that is #1 for me. I think the other thing that you see people do a lot that you can probably skip unless you're giving a much longer talk is an outline. If you're doing a 12-minute talk and I'm like, there's something wrong with the structure of your talk if I can't follow the structure over 12 minutes. I think it makes a lot more sense with longer talks or talks that are bouncing around, but unless there's a really compelling reason, leave yourself that time for something else.
I think
Too many
speakers in general.
Oh,
sorry, Natalia.
no, it's fine. I was just gonna say that too many figures in one slide can be as annoying as too much text. So, yeah, it's just use more than one slide.
I think another really distracting thing that all speakers should pay attention to is the use of the word and I just did it there. Usually they're kind of filler terms for mental breaks. So try to lean more towards the use of silence rather than filling in ums every time. But yeah, there it is again.
Thanks, y'all.
I have another question to ask. For folks that have more experience with pre-recorded talks, or maybe Allison, this is, you know, from the perspective of the actual technical side of Event Pilot as a platform, how many concerns, you know, virtual talks that are live, you might worry about the balance between using engaging video or GIFs or graphics and like it freezing up on the audience or it not coming through? Is it pretty reliable in the pre-recorded talk that if it worked for you in the video, it's going to work in the streaming? Or what considerations do you think about for, you know, what types of engaging things that are maybe only possible in the visual sphere? You don't have to worry anymore if the sound's going to come on with your video or something like that.
I would say if it works when you play it back to yourself, then there's a very high probability that it will work in the Event Pilot. So, you know, basically, I mean, if you really want to test it, so Event Pilot uploads all the talks to Vimeo. So if you really want to test it, you could create a free Vimeo account and upload your talk to Vimeo and see how it looks when it's uploaded there. And otherwise, I wouldn't be worried about anything if it looks good in the recording.
When we do our conference, we check all the talks before running them, but you know, it's pretty labor intensive. But we make sure we do all the talks. We make sure they're within the time. If they're too long, we get back to people and say, your talk's too long. Either, you know, before the deadline, submit one that fits, or we're going to run it and we're going to cut it off at the time. And you know, so we have a lot of interaction. I don't know if you have the staff and the time to do that type of thing, but you know, we check all the talks and stuff.
Yeah, I would say there are way too many talks and not enough staff to check all the talks, unfortunately. But I will also add, like, you can't upload a talk that's too long. It's the system won't let you. So be very aware of your talk length when you're making it. And I really, you know, these AOS guidelines, much of what we're talking about are in these guidelines, you know, not just technical, but also recommendations for talks generally. So definitely check those out too.
Are there any other questions from the audience? We haven't seen anything come into the chat yet, but please feel free to type questions in there if you have any. I guess if there are no more questions, maybe I can just open the floor to the panelists to share if there's any details or things that we didn't cover today that you think are important for us to keep in mind or know as we prepare our presentations. You could share them now.
There are many websites and sites even from universities that do have tips for giving talks. So you could go, you know, you could Google these and look for them. I have a few of them, and I'll drop them in the chat. Obviously, there's a lot more, and they have some pretty useful things. And you'll find that even if you find, you know, 4 or 5 of these sites that list things, you'll see that they converge on some pretty common themes for recommendations. So that there are some resources out there that you can find for this, specifically for this topic.
Yeah, also, you know, just be aware of accessibility for your talk. So, you know, be aware of the colors that you're using and if they're accessible to colorblind people. If you have sounds that you're incorporating into your talk, make sure that they're not going to be really, really loud and jarring to somebody who's watching your talk, or really quiet and really hard to hear. You know, use captions. Please use captions. You need to record them with PowerPoint in the Zoom. You can't use Zoom captioning because that doesn't actually get captured to the screen. And there are instructions for how to do that in the access guide. Yeah, if I think of other things, I'll chime in.
I think my main tip is also like don't be afraid to do things in a different way. And like just like Scott was saying earlier, like when we watch like TV shows, I don't know, Patriot Act or something that it's really engaging the way that they show the graphs or they tell the story. We can borrow them on these like internet or television way of speaking to the audience, and also trying to explain complex concepts in a very like fun and also easy way to understand it. So yeah, don't be afraid to do things in a different way, like to bring some innovation.
I would just add that the sort of resources Felicity share are super important, are super useful, and you should check them. But also, I think at this point, we all have plenty of experience with virtual classes, virtual talks, virtual everything. So also follow your gut, like think of the things you didn't like when you were attending a virtual class or a virtual conference, and try to avoid doing that if you find it distracting or not engaging or whatever. I think our personal experience is very important. It's something that I do also pay attention to when I'm preparing my talks or my virtual whatever, because I think, yeah, that has a lot of value too.
Something that I just thought of, which is important, is pay attention to your image copyrights. If they're not your image, make sure that they're Creative Commons use and they're cited appropriately if they require that. Says, you know, it's important for all talks, but especially important for talks that are recorded and online.
And I'll just lastly comment about the, sorry, Scott, about the importance of speaking slowly during recorded talks. I think that there's several benefits, reducing the cognitive load that you put on your audience, being kind to audience members who don't speak English as a first language. It also pads against slow internet connection. You lose less information if you're buffering. And overall helps to draw the audience closer to you and make your points more meaningful if they're conveyed in a slower way.
So it's a little bit of maybe a meta point, but I think, you know, a lot of the advice that folks have given have been about sort of targeting elements of your talk. And so if you want to do that, you got to be really intentional about what you hope to get out of your talk or your time at AOS. And so it was advice that my PhD advisor gave me early on in my program that was confusing at first and has kind of made more and more sense. You know, not all talks are seeking to get the same thing, right? Sometimes you're sharing results of a published paper and you're trying to highlight that so that people will see it and cite it. Sometimes it's something in progress, and actually your talk is in some ways just asking for help with certain concepts or a certain amount of vetting. Maybe you're talking about an idea that you hope more people adopt, or a method. And so all of those talks would really have different purposes. And when you sort of strip away to the core points, what do you want out of them? What makes the talk good at the end? What do you consider success would look really different for each of those talks. And so rather than jump in and implement all the sort of technical advice and start deleting your slides and scrubbing all your text and building your slides with animations, I think the first step is really think about, you know, what kind of research are you presenting? What do you consider success in that talk? And it's okay to be selfish and think about your career stage too, and make sure that you're getting what you need out of your time at the conference, and let that sort of guide those decisions.
I have one last piece of advice, which is don't be afraid to reach out to people and, you know, message them and be like, hey, I'm giving this talk. I'd love to see what you think. You know, and it doesn't matter how senior that person is. Everybody loves to hear, like, these interactions are what make a conference important, and really seeking them out is especially important in these virtual environment when you're not going to just run into somebody in the hall and be like, oh, hey, you know, Professor so-and-so, I'm studying this. So don't be afraid to send them a Slack message, to send them an email, and be just, you know, point them to your research and your talk and open up that conversation.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, we don't have any questions I see in the chat, so I think this is a great time to wrap things up. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for giving their time today to answer our questions. And thanks to all of our attendees. We'll see you at AOS.